Once, my friends and I decided to explore the outskirts of the city. We lived in Philadelphia, where there is a neighborhood considered less safe. Our parents often warned us about the dangers of being there, but curiosity got the better of us. Venturing out, we found ourselves wandering too far and ended up in a vacant lot with a tall residential building in the distance. We had no idea such a remote and forgotten place existed. There was nothing around us. Here's what happened. We drove around the neighborhood and saw many people whose lives hadn't turned out well. A bit further on, our car broke down. The city was still far away, and we stood by the roadside for about 3 hours. Believe it or not a single passing car stopped to help us. Then my friend Elliot suggested we walk to the high-rise and see if anyone lived there. It seems like nobody lives there, but who knows? Maybe some elderly people stayed behind? We're thirsty and hungry, he said. We all agreed, although the thought of walking across the wasteland wasn't appealing. But we were very hungry and thirsty, having foolishly brought nothing with us. After half an hour of walking, we reached the building. It looked, to put it mildly, in bad shape. Some windows were broken, there was no light, and everything was overgrown with bushes. I doubted anyone lived in that abandoned place. "There's nobody here," I said, peering into the windows. "Yeah, definitely no one," agreed my friend Marcus. On the way back to the car, we glared at Elliot for giving us false hope about finding food and water. When we returned to the car, there was no miracle. The car wouldn't start. Evening was approaching, and leaving the car on the road wasn't an option. We decided to spend the night in the car, as it was too far to walk back. Night fell, and we sat quietly in the car. Suddenly, we heard a noise. It came from the direction of the abandoned building. We heard shouts, laughter, and voices. There were people. Judging by the voices, there were many of them. It sounded like a celebration. "There are people there," Elliot said excitedly. We were thrilled at the thought of finally being able to ask for water and food, and maybe even a place to stay for the night. It was getting very cold, and the night promised to be freezing. Hoping for help, we got out and headed back to the building. Directly in front of the building, a semicircle of people had gathered. A fire was burning, and children were running around, playing some game we didn't understand. About 20 adults were singing songs. A man in a gray suit was playing the accordion. They didn't notice us in the dark, so we had to get closer to attract their attention. Finally, one of the men turned and stared at us. For a moment, it seemed he was frightened. His expression changed from joyful to almost panicked. He was the only one who had noticed us so far, as the others were engrossed in their singing. With a subtle hand gesture, hidden from the others, he clearly indicated, "Go away." His face became stern and serious. "But I'm cold and thirsty. I'm not leaving just like that," I said boldly, surprising myself, and walked straight up to them, loudly announcing, "Hello, my name is Justin, and these are my friends. Our car broke down earlier today, and no one stopped to help us. Can we borrow some water?" I fell silent and waited for a response. Everyone looked at me with surprise and curiosity, as if they were seeing an unknown creature. No one said a word. They just stared at me with hungry eyes. The silence and the multitude of gazes made me uncomfortable. Finally, the old man in the gray suit, who had been playing the guitar, turned and said, "Well, sit by the fire, boys. Warm up first." We all sat by the fire under the intense scrutiny of numerous eyes. The man who had signaled us now appeared calm and just stared at us desperately among the others. The old man in the gray suit resumed playing unfamiliar songs, and the people around continued their revelry and singing. But we felt that our presence had altered the atmosphere. Many glanced at us with hostility and exchanged cryptic looks. After sitting by the fire and feeling noticeably more cheerful, Elliot started doing what he loved most, talking. "Personally, I heard that no one lives in this building. We came by a few hours ago and saw no one," he said to the old man in the gray suit. "That's because we were out hunting. You see, we live far from the city. There are no stores. We need to feed ourselves somehow. By the way, about food and water. Why stay in a cold car? Come, spend the night at my place. There's plenty of room," the old man replied. I thought it was a good idea. Why freeze when you're offered a free place to stay? We agreed, though, of course. We initially hesitated out of politeness. But the old man was so insistent, describing spacious, warm rooms, that we couldn't resist the temptation for long. An hour later, accompanied by the old man and presumably his wife, we entered the building and approached an apartment on the first floor. Inside, we were very surprised. The place was filthy, dusty, and generally looked like no one had ever lived there. "It's just under renovation. Don't worry, the beds are warm. You'll sleep soundly," said the old man with a crazy smile, exchanging a quick glance with his wife. There was something suspicious in that look. I no longer liked the idea of spending the night with strangers. The old man walked into another room. There were 3 in total, gesturing for us to follow him. We all went and found ourselves in a nearly empty room. Except for a large bed and a chair, there was nothing else. I looked at my friends and could tell from their faces that they didn't like it either. "Well, make yourselves at home. I'll go get some water and rabbit meat." They went outside. My friends started settling in, examining the house, and I had an urgent need to use the bathroom. I left the apartment in search of a restroom and suddenly heard a conversation in the darkness. "Let's do it now. Oh, how we needed new ones, especially young ones," a woman's voice said. My head started spinning. I decided to find out what was going on. They were talking outside, so I peeked out. It was the old man and his woman who had brought us here. I couldn't believe what I saw. The old man stood with his back to me, and I clearly saw a long knife sticking out of his back, and in his hand was a cloth stained with blood. He stood there talking as if nothing was wrong. I was petrified, unable to move. Then they turned and started walking towards me. Only then did I snap out of it and ran back to the apartment. My friends had already unpacked, and Elle was dozing on the bed. They looked at me and were scared by my appearance. I must have been pale as a ghost. "Let's get out of here," I shouted like a madman and started running around the room, checking the windows to see if they were open. They were all nailed shut. Despair seized me. I ran to the door and locked it. My friends watched me, one with fear, the other with confusion. Footsteps were heard outside the door. Someone started jiggling the handle. Marcus was about to approach the door and open it, but I blocked it, yelling, "Don't you dare, idiot! Don't you get it? They want to kill us! I heard them talking! Break the window!" My friends looked at me like I was crazy, but I didn't care. I was overcome with wild fear. I realized the impossibility of the situation, and upon reflection, might have thought I had lost my mind, but the terror was so overwhelming that I couldn't think straight. "Hey guys, open the door. We brought you food and waiter," came a voice from behind the door. "Smash it!" I shouted hoarsely, barricading the door from Elliot, although he had already changed his mind about opening it. Everyone was scared out of their wits. Finally, Marcus, who was closest to the window, grabbed a stool and hurled it with all his might. The glass shattered with a crash. "Run! Drop everything and run!" I yelled. The guys, oblivious to their forgotten jackets and socks, dashed toward the window and vanished one by one into the night. I still held on to the door. At first, someone jiggled the handle, but after Marcus smashed the window, everything stopped. I immediately understood what was happening. They had decided to catch us outside. I raced towards the window, through which Elle was currently climbing. He was so afraid to jump, although darn it, it wasn't even that high. And then we saw that a crowd had begun to gather under the window. There were not just a couple of them, but a whole crowd. They all looked like zombies, filthy and rabid, their eyes filled with thirst. The air smelled putrid, the stench emanating from decaying remnants beneath the window. Leading them all was an old man with a knife in his back and his dreadful wife. They were gazing at the fleeing Marcus. I was the only one left. I jumped and ran. I could hear shouts behind me and someone's heavy breathing very close. They were chasing me. I saw the frightened faces of my friends, waiting for me beyond the fence. With a running start, without stopping, I leaped over the fence. Someone grabbed my leg, but I broke free with a terrifying scream, which no doubt was heard everywhere. We ran away from that place. We ran for a very long time. Afterward, utterly exhausted, we sat in complete silence for a while. We were all in such a shock that we couldn't speak. About half an hour later, we flagged down a car. Perhaps the sight of worn-out and exhausted young folks evoked sympathy in the driver. An old man was at the wheel. He asked what had happened to us and where we needed to go. We recounted everything just as it happened, although we didn't even hope that anyone would believe us. The old man silently listened to our tale, then said, "You've been to a bad place, kids. No one has lived there for a long time, and people constantly disappear, never to be found. It's a cursed place. Cursed." The entire way home we were silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Personally, at that moment, I firmly decided that I would never again be curious and wander around villages and construction sites. You never know what might happen. At the age of 16, neither I nor my friends were particularly bright, and here's why. It was back in 2010 when my 3 friends and I were obsessed with exploring abandoned places. Abandoned houses, hotels, and parks all drew us in with their mystique, and on that fateful evening, we chose to visit an abandoned hospital. The history of the hospital was grim. In the 1960s, terrifying things had happened there. Dr. Ben McAllister was the head doctor at the time, and during the war, he conducted experiments on people. We didn't live through the 1960s, but the locals didn't like talking about what happened specifically at this hospital. We were fascinated by such terrifying things, and that time, we decided to see if anything remained from those times. The journey was long. We were traveling from Lancaster to Philadelphia. We went by car, listening to our favorite AC/DC albums and anticipating the adrenaline of what we might encounter in the hospital while the hills around us were bathed in the setting sun. After a few hours of idle chatter about random stuff, we arrived at our destination. The building, to put it mildly, looked horrifying. Trees had overgrown all around, making it impassable, and the hospital itself looked like something out of a horror movie. Chunks of walls had crumbled, windows were smashed, and there was an inexplicable stench. But the most dreadful realization was that there was only one graffiti on the wall, which is a very bad sign for those exploring abandoned places. We exchanged glances with my friends. "We've seen a lot with you, but this place is genuinely creepy," said one of them, Max. "For real, bro," Tom replied eagerly. Taking out our flashlights, we embarked on our adventure. Inside, it didn't look as frightening, just white walls and old decaying furniture, so we decided to split up. There were a total of 5 floors, one of which was the basement. Tom and Max didn't find the strength to go down, so I did it myself. It was terribly frightening to walk alone through the dark corridors, not knowing what to expect. All around me was pitch-black darkness, with only my flashlight casting cold light. In its beam, I stumbled upon a door behind which stood shelves with jars. Coming closer, I saw something I was not prepared for. The jars contained underdeveloped embryos, babies with anomalies, human organs, and even limbs, along with papers detailing various instructions for procedures, or rather, tortures. A shiver ran through my body. What I saw was accompanied by puddles of dark liquid that clearly had never been cleaned up. My mind was filled with questions about how this could even be possible. Suddenly, I heard a piercing scream from my friend Tom. I froze, as anything could have happened to him, and I began to consider all possible scenarios. Deciding that action was necessary, I dashed back upstairs when suddenly the wooden steps gave way beneath my feet. Sensations made it feel like I was falling into an abyss, where someone or something was about to grab my leg and drag me down. My heart pounded incredibly, but in panic I managed to wriggle out of the prickly hole, although I was waist-deep in it. Meeting Max on the second floor, whose eyes were filled with panic, we set off to look for Tom. The third floor was even worse than the basement. The walls and floors were destroyed, with huge patches of already rotten blood, and the beds and equipment made it feel like we were in the game Outlast. The light from our flashlights was not enough to fully see the space around us, and it was terrifying to shine the light and see something dreadful around a corner. Suddenly, in the distance, we saw a faint beam of light. It was Tom's flashlight. We had never been so shaken in our lives. It was hard to keep our feet and move forward with a clear head. Quickly, and as quietly as possible, we made our way to the far end of the corridor where Tom was supposed to be. As we approached, we heard our friend's muffled cry and tears. His mouth seemed to be sealed, but it was enough to realize that we were not alone. Suddenly, a man emerged from that room, standing in the doorway, staring directly at us. His facial deformities defy description. He was not very tall. His facial skin seemed burnt. One eye appeared sightless, and his teeth slanted in different directions. He advanced towards us, causing our hearts to sink. "Lost, are we?" we heard in a rough, barely alive voice. Overwhelmed with fear, we were at a loss. Our voices disappeared as shock paralyzed us. "We just wanted to explore this hospital," Max stammered guiltily. At Max's words, the expression on the man's face shifted from malevolent to insane. His lips formed a smile, revealing all 32 crooked teeth, while his eyes seemed empty and yet filled with dreadful ideas. "Well then, don't just sit there, come in and explore," he replied, pointing to that very room. I desperately wanted to run and had the opportunity, but how could I abandon my 2 friends in danger? We had no choice but to follow this man, as Tom was still in trouble. Entering the room, I felt even worse. Tom was tied to a chair, his mouth gagged with rags. The man ordered us to sit, his tone now serious, and then left for the adjacent room. While he was gone, I quickly scanned the area, trying to shine the flashlight without his notice. In the dark corner directly behind us, I spotted a knife and devised a plan. When he returned, holding jars of liquid and syringes, it didn't take long to figure out their origin. Whispering the plan to Max, we began to act. He shouted at the man and quickly fled from sight, the terrifying figure chasing after him. In that moment, I swiftly grabbed the knife and attempted to free Tom. His eyes filled with horror, his voice trembling. Once it was done, we ran down the route I had planned. We did so quietly, so as not to give the man with the crooked teeth any clues. Through fear and trembling muscles, Tom and I still managed to reach the street, hiding in the bushes. I had never experienced such exhaustion in my life. Our car wasn't far off, so reaching it wasn't a problem. Jumping in, Tom's voice pierced the silence. He was shouting louder than anyone, and I understood why. The journey back took a little longer, as driving in a state of shock was much harder. Since then, we haven't been exploring abandoned hospitals. At the time of these events, I was 20 years old. My childhood friend Stephanie invited me to her birthday party in New Orleans. Without much thought, I agreed, as it had been about 10 years since we last saw each other. Upon arrival, I saw a large house where the rest of our childhood group had already gathered. We were having a great time, and soon we were out of ideas for activities, except for playing Truth or Dare. The question posed to me by my friend, Nico, didn't sit well with me, and I refused to answer it. Looking back, I wish I had answered. In truth, the dare turned out to be much worse than the truth, but in my foolishness, I went ahead with it. The task was as follows. Stephanie mentioned that there was an old abandoned house nearby. According to local rumors, it was inhabited by all sorts of supernatural beings. I didn't believe in such things, so the dare didn't seem impossible to me. We all piled into a car, and after a 20-minute drive, we arrived. Honestly, the house didn't inspire confidence. The facade was covered in layers of peeling paint. The windows on the ground floor were boarded up with rough planks. The garden surrounding it was overgrown with wild vegetation, and a gloomy silence prevailed. The house seemed to breathe its dead air, harboring secrets and terrifying stories that forever remained behind its creaky doors. Inside, an atmosphere of decay prevailed. Every corner was imbued with the spirit of the past and abandonment. A heavy smell of dust, mold, and dampness overpowered the senses, causing coughing. Antique furniture was well preserved, chandeliers reflected the moonlight, and the paintings on the wall seemed to be watching you. I stood for a few seconds at the entrance, absorbing the dead silence, and then, moving down the corridor, I noticed a door that stood out from the others. It was black, and looking at it evoked peculiar sensations. I can't quite describe it, but it beckoned me to enter. For this reason, I decided to leave it for later and continued exploring the expanse. On my way, I encountered various old children's toys. They had an antique design, and the doll faces were quite eerie. One of them even seemed to sing, causing my heart to race. In a moment of complete silence, I heard a faint voice whispering my name, Mason, as if luring me. I turned around, but there was no one around, and I dismissed it as my imagination. The bedroom looked mystical, with a zebra print carpet on the walls and decor reminiscent of African tribes. In the far corner, I found a safe. Upon opening it, I saw a thick book written entirely in Latin, almost like spells, accompanied by various fabrics and needles. Have I stumbled into a voodoo queen's house? This is new, I thought. It seemed intriguing to me. Suddenly it felt like someone with tiny feet ran past me, as agile as a goat. Swiftly turning around, I saw only a portrait of a woman, whose fierce eyes seemed to bore into mine. It felt as if she were a living person, about to leap out of the wall and attack me. Deciding to move further, I stumbled into another room of horror. Its walls were entirely black, adorned with the skins and horns of animals. The floor was worn, with faded white spots, creating a sense of permanence. But the most chilling aspect was a large star drawn right in the center of the room, surrounded by antique candle holders. I wouldn't say I was scared, but being in this house was deeply unsettling. Peripherally, I constantly noticed silhouettes and felt someone's breath passing by me, as if observing from the sidelines or even driving me away. As I prepared to leave, at the exit, I saw that same black door and decided to check it later. The lock had rusted, and with difficulty, I managed to open it. The smell was ominous, as if I were stepping on freshly turned earth in a graveyard, and the staircase leading down gave the impression of descending straight into the ground. My phone had only 2% battery left, but I couldn't afford to be without a flashlight. The moment I illuminated the room, my eyes widened in horror. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The mutilated bodies of animals lay around, as if someone or something had ruthlessly torn them apart into pieces. There were dozens of them. As I gazed towards the far end of the room, my eyes fell upon hearts. They appeared too large for these animals, resembling more human than animal organs. What happened next completely overwhelmed me. A creature more resembling a walking corpse or a severely disfigured person appeared in a small basement window. It was banging its head against the window, protruding its tongue as if trying to speak. Because of the moonlight, it seemed to have no eyes. Ironically, my phone died, and I was left in complete darkness. Panic from what I had seen overwhelmed me. I screamed and ran backward, but the basement door slammed shut with a loud bang, as if something was taunting me. I thought things couldn't get any worse, but I was deeply mistaken. Something seized my leg and mercilessly dragged me down. I fell directly onto the stairs and hit my head. I began to lose consciousness, and the strength to fight for my life deserted me. I thought it was the end. I woke up in Stephanie's house, in bed, surrounded by loved ones. I asked them what had happened, and they said they found me asleep in the basement, where I had slipped and hit my head. When I recounted my story, some of them laughed, and some were simply puzzled because when they arrived, the basement was clean and smelled nice. I don't know what it was or how to explain it, but after what happened, I answer all questions and do not choose my actions.